There is a moment that sometimes happens when a city is digging, when construction crews open the ground for a new tunnel, a new subway line, or the foundations of another building. At first it looks routine: concrete, pipes, cables, the usual infrastructure that keeps modern cities alive. But occasionally, the workers uncover something unexpected: a staircase that descends into darkness, a tiled corridor that leads somewhere no one remembers, a platform edge, perfectly shaped for a train that has not stopped there for decades. And suddenly, it becomes clear that the city beneath the city is larger than anyone realized. Most of us experience cities only at the surface. We see streets, buildings, traffic, and subway entrances that carry us briefly underground before returning us to daylight. The underground world feels simple: a network of tunnels designed to move trains efficiently from one station to the next. But the deeper history of urban transit tells a different story. Beneath many major capitals lies an entire landscape of forgotten infrastructure: platforms sealed behind walls, tunnels that once carried thousands of passengers every day. Stations that were built with ambition and optimism, only to fall silent as cities changed around them. London alone contains dozens of what historians now call ghost stations, abandoned platforms still hidden within the vast maze of the underground. In New York, the elegant City Hall station, once considered one of the most beautiful subway stations ever built, still exists beneath the streets, though trains no longer stop there. In Paris, Berlin, Moscow, and other cities, sealed stairways and brick tunnels mark places where transit systems once followed different routes. What fascinates me about these spaces is not simply that they were abandoned. Cities abandon infrastructure all the time. Roads change, railways are rerouted, neighborhoods evolve. That is part of urban life. What makes these buried stations different is the feeling they create when we see them. Because when photographs emerge from these hidden places, they rarely look like ruins. They look paused, tiles still lining the walls, platform edges intact, arched ceilings disappearing into shadow. Sometimes even the old station signs remain, quietly pointing toward exits that no longer connect to the modern city above. Standing in a place like that must feel strange. You're inside a space that once carried thousands of people every day, yet now the only sound is the distant echo of trains passing somewhere deeper in the system. It is as if a small fragment of the city has been placed into storage beneath the streets, preserved not intentionally, but simply because it was easier to seal it than to remove it. And once you begin to notice these buried stations, you start realizing something even more interesting. They are not isolated accidents. They are evidence of something much larger. Because modern cities did not build their transit systems all at once. They built them in layers, and some of those layers are still down there, waiting in the dark. Once you begin looking into the history of underground transit systems, one thing becomes clear very quickly. Cities rarely build their transportation networks in a single moment of perfect planning. What we see today, the subway maps, the station names, the familiar routes we travel every day, are only the latest version of something that has been evolving for more than a century. Urban transit systems are not static designs. They are living structures that adapt as cities grow, populations shift, and technology changes. New lines are added. Old routes become inefficient. Stations that once stood at the center of a busy district gradually lose their importance as the urban landscape reorganizes itself around new patterns of movement. And when that happens, parts of the system are quietly left behind. London is perhaps the most famous example of this phenomenon. The London Underground, which opened in 1863, is the oldest subway network in the world. Over the following decades, it expanded rapidly, creating a maze of tunnels beneath the city. But expansion did not always mean replacement. When new routes were built or stations relocated, older platforms were often simply sealed off rather than demolished. Today, historians estimate that London contains dozens of these so-called ghost stations, Aldwych, Downstreet, York Road, and several others remain hidden within the active network. Some were closed because passenger numbers declined. Others were bypassed when new tunnels were constructed to improve traffic flow. In many cases, the stations themselves remain almost entirely intact, preserved behind locked doors somewhere along the underground lines. New York offers another remarkable example. When the New York City subway opened in 1904, the original City Hall station was designed not only as a transportation hub, but as an architectural statement. Its platform curves gracefully beneath tiled arches, illuminated by skylights and elegant fixtures that reflected the optimism of the early 20th century. At the time, it symbolized the arrival of modern urban transit, yet within only a few decades, the station had become impractical. As trains grew longer and passenger volumes increased, the tight curvature of the platform made it difficult for trains to stop safely. Rather than redesign the entire station, city planners made a simpler decision. They closed it. Today, the station still exists beneath the streets of Lower Manhattan. Every day, subway trains loop through the tunnel that passes its platform, but they do not stop. The beautiful tiled station remains visible only to transit workers or the occasional historian granted access. Paris has its own hidden network of forgotten platforms. Stations like Croix Rouge and Saint-Martin were closed during the upheavals of the Second World War and never reopened. Some of them were later used as shelters, storage spaces, or training areas for emergency services. Yet, the original platforms remain, their signage and tilework preserved as silent reminders of the era when trains once stopped there. Berlin experienced an even stranger version of this story during the Cold War. Several stations along subway lines that passed beneath East Berlin were sealed off entirely. Trains from West Berlin continued to travel through the tunnels but were forbidden to stop at these stations. For decades, passengers riding those lines would pass through dimly lit platforms guarded by soldiers, places that appeared briefly through the windows before disappearing again into darkness. These spaces became known as ghost stations. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, many of those stations were reopened, revealing platforms that had been sealed and guarded for almost 30 years. What fascinates me about all of these examples is not simply that stations were abandoned. It is how complete those spaces often remain. When engineers close a station, they rarely dismantle everything. Removing a subway platform buried deep beneath a dense city would be far more complicated than sealing its entrances and redirecting traffic elsewhere. So the station remains in place, quietly preserved within the underground labyrinth of the modern system. Over time, these forgotten stations accumulate across the network like geological layers. Each one represents a moment when the city believed it had found the perfect solution for moving millions of people through crowded streets. Each one reflects the technology, planning philosophy, and architectural style of its era. And yet, none of those solutions remain permanent, because cities do not stop changing. They build, they adapt, and sometimes, when a new line is constructed or an old tunnel rediscovered, they reveal fragments of their own past, hidden just beneath the ground we walk across every day. One of the things that surprises people the most when they see photographs of these buried stations is how beautiful many of them are. When we think about transportation infrastructure today, we usually imagine something purely functional. Concrete platforms, fluorescent lighting, simple signage designed to move passengers efficiently from one place to another. Most modern stations are built with practicality in mind, not elegance. But the earliest generations of subway systems were designed very differently. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, underground transit represented something entirely new. These systems were not just practical solutions to traffic congestion. They were symbols of progress. Engineers, architects, and city planners believed they were building the transportation networks that would define the future of urban life. And because of that belief, many early stations were designed with an almost unexpected level of care. Arched ceilings lined with carefully arranged tiles, decorative mosaics that marked station names, cast-iron railings shaped with ornamental patterns, even lighting fixtures were sometimes designed to soften the underground atmosphere, creating spaces that felt less like tunnels and more like subterranean halls. New York's early subway stations are a good example of this philosophy. Many of them were built with elaborate tile work produced by companies that specialized in architectural ceramics. The walls were covered with patterned mosaics, colored borders, and station emblems designed to help passengers identify their location even from a distance. Paris followed a similar approach. The original Paris metro stations were designed in a distinctive Art Nouveau style with elegant entrances created by architect Hector Guimard. Beneath the streets, platforms were lined with white ceramic tiles arranged in gentle curves that reflected the light and made the underground spaces feel brighter and more open. London's underground developed its own visual identity as well. Early stations often featured deep red tilework and distinctive signage that would eventually become one of the most recognizable transit symbols in the world. All of this attention to design tells us something interesting about how people once imagined underground transportation. They did not see it as a temporary necessity. They saw it as a permanent feature of the modern city, and because of that, they invested in the architecture of these spaces with surprising ambition, which is why the abandoned stations can feel so haunting when we see them today. Unlike many other forms of infrastructure, subway stations are not easily removed. They are carved deep beneath streets that continue to function long after the station itself has closed. When a platform becomes obsolete, it is often easier to seal it off than to dismantle it completely, so the architecture remains. Over time, dust settles on the tiles. Electrical systems are removed or replaced. Access stairways are sealed behind locked gates or concrete walls. But the basic structure of the station stays exactly where it was built, and that creates an unusual effect. Because when photographers or urban explorers occasionally document these spaces, the images do not resemble ruins in the traditional sense. They look suspended in time. A platform where no train stops, a corridor where no passengers walk, a sign pointing toward an exit that no longer exists. Sometimes even old advertisements remain on the walls, faded posters promoting products that disappeared generations ago. Standing in one of these spaces must feel strangely quiet. Above ground, the city continues its constant movement. Traffic flows through streets. People move between offices, homes, and train stations that now belong to a different network. But below, the abandoned platform remains exactly where it was left. It becomes a kind of architectural memory, a physical reminder of how the city once organized itself. What fascinates me most about these places is that they reveal something we rarely think about when looking at modern cities. Urban infrastructure does not vanish when it becomes outdated. It accumulates. Every generation builds new systems designed to solve the problems of its time. And when those systems are replaced, they are often left behind rather than erased. Over decades and centuries, those abandoned layers create a hidden map beneath the visible city. Platforms that once felt modern become relics. Tunnels that once carried thousands of commuters every morning become empty corridors. And somewhere beneath the streets we walk every day, entire fragments of earlier cities remain quietly waiting in the dark, not destroyed, just forgotten. The more I learned about these forgotten stations, the more I realized that they reveal something deeper about the way cities evolve. At first, I assumed abandoned platforms were simply leftovers from outdated planning, mistakes corrected as urban transportation improved. But after looking at enough examples from different cities, that explanation began to feel incomplete. What these hidden spaces really show is that cities rarely erase their past completely. They build over it. When we look at a modern subway map, the network appears neat and intentional, as if it were designed all at once by engineers who perfectly understood how the city would grow. But that is not how urban infrastructure actually develops. Each generation builds what it believes will solve the problems of its time. Decades later, new technologies, new neighborhoods, and new patterns of movement appear, forcing the system to change again. And when the network changes, pieces of the old system are often left where they are. A platform becomes unnecessary because trains are longer. A tunnel becomes obsolete because a faster route has been built nearby. A station closes because the district around it slowly shifts from residential to commercial or industrial. From the perspective of city planning, these decisions make perfect sense. Transportation systems must adapt or they become inefficient. But from a historical perspective, the result is something fascinating, a hidden archive of earlier versions of the city. Every sealed station tells a small story about how people once moved through urban space. I sometimes try to imagine what these places were like when they were still active. 100 years ago, platforms like these would have been filled with ordinary life. Commuters waiting for trains, station attendants calling out arrivals, the sound of footsteps echoing across tile floors. To the people who use those stations every day, they must have felt permanent. No one boarding a train in 1910 would have imagined that the platform beneath their feet might one day be abandoned and forgotten. And yet, that is exactly what happened. What strikes me most about this process is how quietly it occurs. Cities rarely make dramatic announcements when infrastructure disappears. A station closes, the entrances are sealed, and gradually people stop thinking about it. Within a generation or two, the space passes from memory entirely, but the physical structure remains. And that is the detail I find most compelling. Because if you think about it carefully, the underground parts of cities change far more slowly than the surface above them. Buildings are demolished and rebuilt constantly. Entire neighborhoods transform within a few decades. But deep tunnels and platforms carved beneath dense urban environments are far more difficult to remove, so they remain. Sometimes they are repurposed. In London, some abandoned stations were used as air raid shelters during the Second World War. Others became storage facilities or emergency infrastructure. In Paris, certain unused platforms have been converted into training areas for firefighters or used temporarily for art installations, but many simply sit there in darkness. And I cannot help finding something strangely poetic about that, because when we walk through a city today, we tend to think we are seeing the present. The streets feel contemporary, the buildings modern enough to belong to our time. Yet, beneath those streets lie entire fragments of earlier urban worlds, places that once carried crowds of people and now exist only as quiet chambers beneath the pavement. In a way, abandoned stations remind us that cities are not single creations. They are layered structures. Every generation adds something new while leaving traces of what came before. Most of those traces disappear from memory, but they remain physically embedded within the landscape. And every so often, when construction crews dig deeper or historians gain access to sealed tunnels, a small piece of that buried history briefly reappears. A staircase descending into darkness, a platform edge illuminated by a photographer's flashlight, a station sign still pointing toward a train that stopped running decades ago. When I see those images, I do not just think about transportation systems or engineering decisions. I think about the millions of ordinary lives that once passed through those places, people rushing to work, returning home, meeting friends on platforms that felt as familiar to them as our modern stations feel to us today. Those moments are gone now, but the spaces where they happened are still there, waiting quietly beneath the city. One question naturally follows when we look at these buried stations. Why were they abandoned in the first place? After all, building a subway station deep beneath a crowded city is not a small task. It requires enormous engineering effort, vast amounts of material, and careful planning. Once such a structure exists, why would a city choose to leave it behind? The answer, in most cases, is surprisingly simple. Cities change faster than infrastructure can keep up. When the earliest underground railways were built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, engineers were working with limited information about how cities would grow. Populations were increasing rapidly, neighborhoods were expanding, and new technologies were transforming transportation almost every decade. The first subway planners were pioneers. They could not rely on long histories of underground transit to guide them. Instead, They made educated guesses about where stations would be needed and how passengers would move through the city. For a time, many of those guesses worked remarkably well. Stations were built near government centers, commercial districts, and major residential neighborhoods. Platforms were designed for the trains of the era, which were shorter and lighter than the ones we see today. Tunnel routes followed the geography and engineering limitations of the time. But cities rarely stay the same. As decades passed, new districts emerged, older neighborhoods changed their purpose, and transportation technology improved. Trains became longer, faster, and capable of carrying far more passengers. Subway lines that had once seemed perfectly adequate began to struggle under the pressure of modern commuter traffic. When that happens, city planners face a difficult choice. They can attempt to redesign older stations, which often means rebuilding tunnels in extremely dense urban environments. Or they can construct entirely new stations nearby, designed for modern train systems and larger passenger flows. In many cases, building something new turns out to be easier than modifying something old. So the original station closes, and once it closes, the most practical solution is often to seal it rather than remove it. Demolishing an underground station would require excavating beneath streets, buildings, and utilities that have developed around it over decades. The cost and disruption would be enormous. Leaving it in place is simply easier. That practical decision is what creates the strange phenomenon we see today. A station closes, its entrances are locked, its signage removed from maps, and trains begin stopping somewhere else. Within a few years, most passengers forget it ever existed. A generation later, only transit historians remember its name. But beneath the streets, the station is still there. And this is where my own perspective on cities began to change a little. When I was younger, I imagined urban infrastructure as something constantly replacing itself. Old systems disappear and new ones take their place. Progress moves forward in a straight line. But the reality is far more layered. Cities do not erase their past as efficiently as we often assume. Instead, they accumulate it. Each generation builds new systems while leaving fragments of older ones behind. Over time, these fragments become hidden rooms within the structure of the city. Sealed stations, unused tunnels, forgotten platforms that once played a central role in everyday life. And every now and then, when someone finds a photograph of one of these places, we are reminded that the cities we know today are only the newest layer of something much older. The trains no longer stop there, but the station still waits, quietly, beneath the streets. Every so often, something unexpected happens in a modern city. A construction crew begins digging for a new subway extension, a parking structure, or the foundation of a skyscraper. The work proceeds normally at first. Concrete, pipes, soil layers that engineers already anticipated. But then, the machines break through into something no one planned for. A wall appears where there should only be earth. A staircase emerges from the side of the excavation pit. Sometimes it is an entire corridor, tiled and shaped by human hands, leading into darkness beneath the streets. In those moments, the city briefly rediscovers a piece of itself. Engineers pause the work. Historians are called in. Photographs are taken. For a short period, the hidden structure becomes visible again. A forgotten station, an abandoned tunnel, a platform that once echoed with the sound of trains. Then, almost inevitably, the project continues. The space is sealed once more, reinforced, covered, and the city above returns to its ordinary rhythm. What fascinates me about these rediscoveries is how calmly they are usually treated. They are recorded as interesting discoveries, small historical footnotes within the larger story of urban development. But if you step back and look at the pattern, the meaning feels deeper, because these moments reveal that the ground beneath modern capitals is far more complex than we tend to imagine. It is not empty space, carved only for the infrastructure we currently use. It is filled with earlier attempts to shape the city. Earlier systems of movement that were once considered modern, efficient, and permanent. I remember the first time I saw photographs of an abandoned station platform illuminated by construction lights. Dust covered the tiles, old signage still hung from the walls, pointing passengers toward trains that had not arrived for decades. And I had a strange thought. To the people who built that station, it must have represented the future. They believed they were creating something lasting, a piece of infrastructure that would serve the city for generations. Engineers carefully measured the tunnels, architects designed the platforms, workers laid every tile by hand. Yet only a few decades later, the station was already obsolete. Standing there today, it feels less like a ruin and more like a message from an earlier version of the city. A reminder that even our most advanced systems may one day become forgotten layers beneath something newer. That realization changes the way I look at cities. When we walk through modern capitals, London, Paris, New York, Tokyo, we tend to see only the present. The trains running today, the stations on current maps, the infrastructure that feels permanent and complete. But beneath those active systems lies a quiet archive of earlier decisions, earlier technologies, earlier ideas about how a city should function. Every abandoned platform, every sealed tunnel, every forgotten station is part of that archive. They remind us that cities are never finished. They evolve, adapt, and rebuild themselves continuously, leaving traces of each stage behind like geological layers beneath the surface. And perhaps the most intriguing thought is this. If the underground layers we know about already contain so many forgotten stations and transit systems, how many more remain undiscovered? How many corridors still lie hidden beneath the streets, waiting for the moment when a construction crew accidentally breaks through the wall and the city briefly remembers another piece of its past? Because if history has taught us anything, it is that cities rarely reveal all of their layers at once. Sometimes they wait decades, sometimes they wait centuries, but eventually the ground always tells its story. When we look at abandoned stations and forgotten transit systems, it is easy to treat them as curiosities, small historical details hidden beneath modern infrastructure. But the longer I think about them, the harder it becomes to see them that way. Because these spaces quietly reveal something profound about how human civilization actually develops. We often imagine history as a straight line. Cities are built, technologies improve, systems become more advanced, and everything moves forward in a clear direction. Yet, the underground layers of our cities tell a different story. They show us that progress is rarely clean. Entire systems, once considered cutting edge, can vanish within a generation. Infrastructure that took enormous effort to build can be sealed and forgotten when a new idea replaces it. What was once the center of movement and energy can become nothing more than a quiet chamber beneath the pavement. And perhaps the most humbling part of this realization is that the same thing may be happening today. The stations we use every morning feel permanent. The transit networks mapped across our phones appear stable and complete. Engineers design them carefully, believing they will serve the city for decades. But if history repeats itself, and it usually does, many of these systems will eventually become just another buried layer, another set of tunnels future generations might rediscover, another forgotten map beneath the streets. That thought changes the way I look at cities now. Instead of seeing them as finished creations, I see them more like living organisms, constantly rebuilding themselves, constantly adapting, constantly leaving traces of earlier versions behind. Every sealed station is a reminder that the present is only temporary. Every abandoned tunnel is evidence that cities remember more than we do. And sometimes, when the ground opens during construction and an old platform appears again in the light, it feels almost like the city is briefly telling us its own story. Not loudly, just enough for those who are paying attention. So the next time you stand on a subway platform waiting for a train, consider this. Somewhere beneath your feet, there may already be another platform, older, darker, and forgotten, where trains once arrived, carrying people who believed their city looked exactly the way it always would. History has a way of repeating that moment, and if you are curious about the hidden layers beneath modern civilization, the forgotten streets, the buried infrastructure, and the strange patterns that appear when we look closely at our cities, then stay with this series, because in the next explorations, we will go even deeper, not to claim that history is wrong, but to observe the quiet evidence that still exists beneath our feet.